Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Stories to Make You Shiver, Volume 6, Story Number 1. This is Christmas of 2019. The location, my cabin in Savannah, Tennessee. The wife and I had invited her niece and family for a joint vacation. The visiting family had 3 children, a female drama queen aged 9, a boy aged 13, and another female who was 19. The 2 youngest spent their time outdoors during daylight hours being loud, bickering, in other words, acting like normal juvenile siblings. On Christmas Day, we cooked the turkey outdoors using a Brinkmann propane-fired oilless turkey fryer that turned out amazing. At 9 p.m., I went onto the deck for a cigarette, and a 13-year-old wanting some time away from his younger sister went out first. I was a step behind him and his father a step behind me. The scent of human feces was so strong that we all commented on the fact within a few seconds. The door being open long enough for 3 persons to exit let in the smell so strong that the females sitting in the living room experienced the stench as well. The wind currents were coming from an angle that put a possible septic field leakage being downwind as unlikely. The scent, after 30 minutes later, was less intense but still there. A lot of discussion followed. I later went out with a UV flashlight and a regular flashlight and was unable to find any evidence of a septic field leak. The next day, the wife used her lawn tractor mower to mulch the leaves in the backyard and also couldn't find a source or evidence for the now gone smell. The next day, my neighbor stopped by for a visit and told me about 10 years ago, something was making roars so loud one night that he decided there wasn't enough money in the world that could persuade him to investigate the source, even if armed. We have a surveillance camera covering the camp driveway. To date, just stray dogs, maybe coyotes, as the distance was too far, and that's all that ever comes by our property, or at least that's been caught by the camera. Story number 2. When I was about 8 years old, my mom was having a garage sale. We lived on an old 4-lane highway, Old Highway 84 in southwest Mississippi. That was no longer a main highway, and so it wasn't really busy. It was a very rural area, and houses were far enough apart that you felt isolated. As the summer evening rolled around, my mother was wrapping up and had gone inside when a large, rusty red truck pulled down our gravel drive and up to the carport. I assumed the man with the red beard who got out was there for the garage sale. I thought nothing of it as he knelt down and started talking to my little brother, who was about 5 or 6. I was about 15 feet away, so couldn't hear what he said, but remember feeling anxious like my mom could miss a sale because this guy may take the absence of any adults as a sign the sale is over and may leave. So I yelled for her really loud, and as I did, this man jumped to his feet, scrambled to his truck, and left quickly enough that he sprayed us with gravel a little. I remember being so confused for a moment, wondering what I did or said wrong, but I shrugged it off. I was thinking about it days later when I suddenly came to the conclusion he was trying to kidnap my little brother. I told my parents, who kind of brushed it off, my mom convincing me I misunderstood or made it up, partly because my very controlling and jealous dad always accused my mom of being too busy socializing on the phone, which she wasn't allowed to do after he got home in the evenings, or with some secret lover to watch us properly while he was at work. So I know she wouldn't have wanted to give him any more ammunition for wild accusations, so didn't allow the conversation to go further. I could be wrong. We'll never know, but this was an odd response to a child calling for the mother, if they have stopped in for the yard sale. Gives me the creeps to this day. My brother will ask me about it from time to time, and wants me to recount the story to him, as it kind of creeps him out as well, though he has no recollection of it. Next story. Well, this happened to me and my 3 siblings. We're all very close in age. Mom had 4 kids in 5 years. We were military kids. My dad was career United States Air Force. Most of the time we lived on base, but when we lived in the UK, base housing was very limited. We ended up living in Cambridge. UK, and my dad drove to Alconbury Air Force Base every day. He had driven the only car, and we walked or rode a bus everywhere we needed to go. We had a big backyard and a small front yard with a small fence across the front. The address was 37 Leys Road. Now, it appears the house has undergone some kind of revitalization. Back then, the youngest was a baby, and so me and my siblings would play out front or on the sidewalk or with the neighbor kids. One late afternoon, we had walked back from school and were playing with the other kids outside. A group of teenagers walked down the street and then back. They did this several times. Now, we're all under the age of 11. The teenager said something to the neighbor kid, and he said something back to them. Suddenly, two of them came into the yard and grabbed my sister, who was about 7. All of us started screaming and tried to grab her legs. They were trying to get her into a car that came out of nowhere. One of the kids had run to get a parent. His dad came running out from across the street yelling and had a cricket bat in his hand, swinging for all he was worth. The teenagers dropped my sister and took off. By now my mom was outside and the rest of the kids. My dad came home. My mom called the police, the bobbies, and 2 cars came. They talked to all of the kids and the father who had come out swinging the bat. All he could give the police was a general description of the young men. They weren't from the neighborhood. The police never caught them, and for the longest time none of us were allowed to play out front. Much later, my mom told us, about 15 years later, that the police told her that gangs were kidnapping little girls to sell to sex offenders, and that my sister was very lucky. Next story. Well, this was back in 2016, I think. It was about midnight. I just left a car meet on the northwest side of Houston and was following a buddy. I was in my Mustang, and he was in his F-150. He was going to grab a bite to eat before we drove home. We pulled into a closed gas station, and he gassed his truck up. Meanwhile, I parked my car in front of the gas station and went over to talk to him. Now, this is a good time to mention that I'm a female and have a healthy, maybe a little unhealthy fear of being raped, murdered, and chopped up into little pieces. As we're talking and he's pumping gas, I notice a red Dodge Ram with a man pull into the gas station lot, park, and just sit there. My buddy finishes pumping his gas, and I walked to my car and started up. I pulled out of the parking lot behind my buddy onto a dark 4-lane road. The red Dodge Ram immediately pulled out behind me. It's following me very closely, switching lanes when I switched lanes. If I sped up, he sped up. If I slowed down, he slowed down. All I was sure about is that he was definitely following me. Was he following me because I'd been parked at a closed gas station and was trying to see if I was up to no good? Maybe. Did he want to run me down, rape and murder me? Most likely. I called my buddy in front of me and told him that I was about to pass him and that I'd be hauling ass because the man behind us was following me and I'm effing scared. I slammed the car into 3rd gear and did what you're supposed to do with an 11-second Mustang. I never slowed down and I never looked back. My buddy gunned it in his truck too and tried to stay between me and the red truck. After that, the red truck gave up. However, that's not my only story. When I was 20, this is about 2003, it was a weekend night and I didn't have anything to do. And as a young female, that was pure torture. Around 3 a.m., I left the house heading towards something. A car meet, a friend's party, I don't remember. I was in my mom's truck because my car was down for maintenance. My mom's truck was fairly nice. It was a 99 F-150 4x4 Lariat with a 5.4 and every conceivable accessory on the market. I was heading west on Vista Road in Pasadena, Texas, and I'm about to pass through the intersection of Vista and Preston. I have the green light. There's one other car at the intersection. It's a white GMC Jimmy, and it's waiting at the red light on Preston to turn left onto Vista. As soon as I passed through the intersection, the Jimmy ran the light, pulled up next to me in the right lane. I look over and I see a hand out of the window trying to get my attention. I run some questions through my mind. Is this a cop? Probably not. Am I dragging something from the truck? No. Do I have a flat? Doesn't feel like it. That's enough for me to decide I'm not going to stop. But he's making me very uncomfortable, so I try to speed up. He does the same. I slow down. He slows down, always staying right next to me. I see a turnaround and the median coming up, so I prepare to take it. I turn into it, and he somehow manages to turn into it faster than me and blocks me. So I backed up and continued down Vista. He did the same. This is when he got tired of playing around and pulled out the gun. I saw the barrel of a pistol sticking out the crack at the top of the driver's side window. I'm fairly freaked out now at this point. I assume, as always, that he wants to kidnap, rape, and murder me, so I threw caution to the wind and decided that reckless driving is my best bet. I floored the truck, and he kept up, but there was a red light up ahead. I didn't stop, and neither does he, but he slowed down. I blew through that red light and the next one. At the second red light, gave up and turned right to go down another street. I got on a different, very heavily traveled and well-lit road and started to head back towards home and call the cops on my cell. While I'm relaying my story to them, I see the distinct taillights of the white Jimmy on the road well ahead of me. I told the cops that I could see the Jimmy and tell them exactly where it is. They didn't seem to care about catching him, just reiterating that if I felt afraid, then I could drive to the police station. Home was closer and on a much better lit street, so that's what I did. When I thought about it later, I realized that my driver's side window had been up and it was tinted so dark that he couldn't have seen me when I passed through the intersection. So he probably wasn't after me. He most likely just wanted the truck, as that would have been a valuable truck to steal back then. Let's just say I don't drive late at night unless I have a damn good reason, and I never go unarmed anymore. I looked for that white Jimmy in that area for years and years, but luckily, or lucky for him, I never came across him. Next story. I was in Williamsburg, Virginia, because of a death in the family. I stayed an extra week with my sister-in-law and hubby and had to go back to work. I went to take the ferry across to Scotland Neck and realized I still had my niece's car seat in the back of my car. I did a quick turn around to take it back. I missed the ferry. I was on the ferry, not paying much attention to other people. It's a nice September day. This was before cell phones. And I'm cruising along Virginia 40. It was a nice drive until I noticed someone behind me, way too close. The man is driving a gold-colored Grand Prix. He pulled up beside me and waved. I ignored him. This road is a two-lane road through the back roads of Virginia. Not much of anything except farms. He pulled up beside me again and tried to get me to pull over, where I have no clue as it's swampy too. He tried to get in front of me. Nope and nope. I'm driving a Riviera and gun it. Cars coming the other way force him back behind me. I'm now very concerned. He kept playing this cat and mouse game, and I know in 20 minutes or so I can get on I-95, even though I usually come back on I-85. I was speeding along and hoping for a trooper, and of course none came up. The man behind me was right on my bumper, and he's laughing. As we were approaching the bridge and exits, I see a Virginia State Trooper on the bridge. I am too fast to safely stop behind him, so I flip on my emergency flashers and lay on the horn as I drive by him and get on I-95. As I hoped, he cut his lights on and pulled me over. The man in the car flew by me. I was sobbing because I was so scared. The trooper was very nice. I explained that the gold-colored car that was behind me had followed me since the ferry, had tried to run me off the road, and kept right on my bumper and kept pulling up beside me and tried to get me to stop. He said, "Don't worry." He got back in his car and took off. Lights and sirens. I went to the next exit, stopped, got something to eat and drink, turned around, and took I-85 home. This was at that time that women had been found dead in Dinwiddie County and along the Colonial Parkway. I think the Parkway murders are still unsolved. Next story. Well, this happened many years ago, and I didn't think too much about it at the time. Since then, I've read the 411 Missy books, and I think I used to walk, hike the trails by myself because I don't like to wait for someone to decide they want to go too. However, I don't go alone anymore. My husband is retired military, so not too afraid of much and very much aware of situational awareness. This was probably in the late 80s, and we decided to go hike at the Huari National Forest. It isn't too much of a drive, and we weren't going overnight. No cell phones, and I might have had a small film camera. No digital. Honestly, it's been so long ago that I don't remember the trail name. We got there. There were no other trucks or car in the parking lot, and we didn't see any other people. We were walking, enjoying nature and talking. Had hiked a couple of hours, and we came to a fork in the trail and decided to go left. The trail went slightly up a hill, and there was a small footbridge across the stream. We decided this would be a good turning around point. We got to the bridge, maybe 3 feet wide at most, and I'm looking in the stream for fish or whatever else there might be. I noticed that I didn't hear any birds or forest sounds and remarked to my hubby that it was really quiet and peaceful here. It was very thick with trees, but the trail is fairly well maintained. I saw movement in the trees, and I thought it was probably a deer, very common in that area. My hubby's looking around and suddenly says, "We need to go, and now." I know him well enough not to argue. We hurried back to the parking lot in the truck. As we're going back, my hubby keeps looking behind us, and a few times he walked backwards and watched the trail behind us. We finally got closer to the parking lot and a few other people. Once we were safely in the truck, I asked him, what was that all about? He said he felt like there was someone or something watching and following us. He said whatever stayed just out of sight in the trees, but he could see movement. My husband isn't one to overreact, but he was definitely upset that day. Once we got closer to the truck and the people, he said that whatever it was disappeared back into the forest. We haven't been back there ever to the Huaris. There have been reports of Bigfoot in that area. I didn't see anything that day, and all my husband felt was a presence. But I trust his instincts. Next story. This happened during the summer of '82, right after we graduated from high school. Two friends and I decided to take a few days and go backpacking in the Ouachita National Forest in far southeast Oklahoma. Specifically, we were on Winding Stair Mountain. There's a national hiking trail that follows along the crest of that mountain. It's really more like a ridge than a mountain. And although it's called a mountain, we're not talking elevation like in the Rockies, for example. Winding Stair Mountain probably averages between 2,000 to 2,500 feet. But for Oklahoma, that's pretty good. On the second night into our trip, we stopped to camp along a stretch of the trail that overlooks a valley. At the bottom of the valley, a couple of miles away, you can see a lake called Lake Bohannon. And although we couldn't see it from our vantage point, next to that lake is a Boy Scout camp called Camp Tom Hale. One of my friends on this trip had been in the Boy Scouts and had spent time at that camp. And as you might expect, they told stories to each other about a Bigfoot-like monster that roamed the forest out there. Anyway, we set up camp right on the hiking trail. In fact, we built our campfire ring on the trail itself. The reason is because the trail was broad, hard-packed bare earth, so we felt this was the safest. Besides, we hadn't seen any other hikers during our time out there, and we promised ourselves that next morning we would completely douse the coals and redisperse the fire ring. That way there wouldn't be hardly any trace left that we had ever built a campfire there. For sleeping, I brought a mesh hammock which I strung up between two trees. I set it up parallel to the trail, and I had the campfire to my immediate left. My two friends slept on the ground, spreading out a tarp and sleeping bags directly opposite of the campfire from me, on the other side of the trail. To my right, I had a nice view of that valley and the lake with the mountains sloping down away from me. As it got dark, we cooked dinner over the fire, BS'd around for a while, and then finally turned in for a night. It was a clear, beautiful summer night, with a soft breeze coming up from the valley. We continued to talk for a while after everyone had gone to bed, but eventually drifted off to sleep in my hammock. At some point during the night, I woke up. I'm sure I had a watch on me, but I don't remember now the exact time. However, it must have been well after midnight because I saw that our campfire had burned itself down to just a bed of coals. I lay there for a minute, looking up at the stars through the pine tree tops, wondering what had caused me to wake up. And then I heard it. It sounded like something walking through the underbrush, up the slope to my right and towards our camp. It would walk a little, then stop, then walk some more, then stop again. But it was definitely getting closer. Now, I'm no expert woodsman, but to me, it didn't sound like a four-footed animal, which would make a sound more like a continuous rustle through the leaves and underbrush. This sounded like individual footsteps, like something walking on 2 feet. There was really nothing I could think of to do except just keep quiet and wait to see what would happen. The only weapons I had with me were a hatchet for chopping firewood and a hunting knife. Fortunately, I had both of these with me in the hammock, sheathed of course, because I am paranoid like that. So I quietly unsheathed them, clutched one in each hand, waited, and listened. Whatever was finally got to what sounded like a few dozen feet from our camp and then stopped again. Next, instead of coming even closer, it started to circle our camp. And of course, it circled our camp in a direction that had it going behind me as I lay in my hammock, rather than the direction that my feet were pointing, which meant that if it approached closer, I could not see what it was without sitting up or even rolling completely out of my hammock. Eventually, it circled around until it was directly behind my head as I lay in the hammock, but still keeping its distance. Then things got quiet again. Now you'll remember that I mentioned that the hiking trail was broad, hard packed earth. I thought to myself, whatever it is, could now just walk down the trail towards our camp and not make a sound. I wouldn't even know it was there until it was literally standing right next to me, where I could look up from my hammock and see it. If you've ever heard that saying about your blood running cold, it's true. I actually felt like I had ice water running through my veins at that point. However, a moment later, the sound of it walking through the leaves and underbrush started again. It had not walked down the trail towards our camp after all, but had instead crossed the trail and was now behind me and to my upper left. It continued to circle our camp until it got to a point roughly directly to my left, a few dozen feet beyond the spot where my friends were sleeping. It stopped there for a few minutes, and then it began retracing its path. It crossed the trail again, directly up behind me as I lay in the hammock, and walked back into the underbrush to my upper left. It circled back around until it was to my direct right again, approximately to where it had started, and then it went back down the mountainside until I could no longer hear it in the distance, and it moved through the underbrush. I continued to lay there in my hammock, wondering what it could have been. Then suddenly, one of my friends whispered from out of the darkness on the other side of the fire ring, "Hey, Brett, are you awake?" I replied that I was, and he asked, "Did you hear that too?" This was the friend who had been a Boy Scout. I said yes. It woke me up, and I laid here listening to it this whole time. Then we both got up and immediately built our campfire back up. We had saved back some firewood to use for cooking breakfast in the following morning, but we threw it all on the fire now instead. We sat there for a while talking and comparing notes about what we'd heard, but eventually we both calmed down again and finally went back to bed with no further incidents for the rest of the night. The third guy had slept through the whole thing. He didn't even wake up when we got up and rebuilt our campfire. The next day we headed back down the trail towards the trailhead, spent the third night on the mountain with nothing unusual happening, and went home the following day. We actually went backpacking out there again a few times over the next couple of years when we were all home from college or whatever, but nothing like that ever happened again. And now it's been decades since the last time I was down in that part of the state. Next story. This was out in the hills of the UK in a national park. Quite an isolated area. It's a bright sunny day, quite warm, blue skies, not a cloud in sight, 5-mile-per-hour wind. I was on my friend's farm and we were in a mule taking corn out for feeding the duck flight pools. We had just fed one and we stood by the mule talking. Suddenly overhead was a swooshing noise that came from the south that passed over us headlong north. It was quite loud and immediately I thought that a glider was passing over us at low altitude, no more than 100 feet up. It was loud and near, no engine noise at all, just this hiss-type swoosh that you hear when a glider passes over, building in volume as it comes to you and then fading away as it passes over and goes away. It sounded large. Both looked up as it was directly overhead, expecting to see a low-flying glider, and looked all around. Nothing at all. Not a zilch, not a bird in the sky, no drones, no plane, no glider, nothing. We looked at one another and said, "Did you hear that?" "Yep." "Did you see anything?" "Nope." "What the heck was that?" That's a polite version of our discussion. It was freaky. As we drove away, my friend posed a thought. Maybe we just witnessed some military black ops invisibility cloaked aerial phenomena. Who knows? But then something else weird happened, but this was about a year before. Further over on his land, we had parked a mule near to a fence over which is a young forest plantation, 15-foot tall spruce and larch, with an impenetrable jungle of undergrowth of silver birch, alder, and hazel saplings below them in full summer leaf. This farm is totally surrounded by thousands of acres of forest. We stood under the cover of a few mature silver birches growing out into the field and let go with a foxcrow collar on rabbit squeal to draw crows out of a mature Scots pine block 100 yards away adjoining this younger block that we had done successfully. I had fired 2 shots, and during a lull as we waited to see if any more crows were coming in, about 30 yards away in this jungle, there was a slashing sound, just as if a person had slashed undergrowth with a machete, but the sweep or slash of such was far longer than anyone could perform in a single arm swing. It lasted 3 or 4 seconds. Then, a few seconds later, it happened again. We both looked at each other like, what the? We continued with a collar, and then in a pause, it happened again, just the same as the first time. As it was happening, I looked at the treetops to see if there was any movement. Nothing. The plantation is so thick you cannot see 5 yards into it. We knew no person would be in there, and we discussed what on earth could be doing it, and what the heck was it. Shortly after it happened a third time. That was it. My hair stood up on the back of my neck and my arms, and my sixth sense has said, okay, time to go. I was spooked. I leveled my Benelli at the trees and backed up to the mule and said to my mate, right, that does it, let's get out of here. We are both good old country boys that live to hunt and camp out, know every animal, bird, sound, and such, and don't ever spook at all, 'cause it isn't like we have cougar or bears or anything like that to contend with over here in the UK. But this was totally weird. We have no idea to this day what caused that sound, and often mention it and cannot for the life of us come up with what it could have been. It's turning out to be a farm of weird noises. Next story. This is a story my great-grandpa told me when I had come over to pay him a visit. He was a rancher in his younger days. If any one of you are familiar with South Central Texas ranches, Durwood Ranch may ring a bell. Anyway, he told me one time he had driven out onto one of his section off pastures to feed the cattle when he noticed something on the limb of a massive old oak tree at the fence line. He got into the bed of the truck to try and get a better view. He said it was a large, muddy red shape. He watched it for a while longer, and just before he jumped down from the truck bed to drive over to it, he saw it stand up and spread what looked like short wings. Once standing, it looked like a very wide human with comparatively short, flat wings, and from head to toe was deep brownish red. He got in his truck and turned it around to drive towards it, but by the time the truck was facing the old oak, the shape was gone. He reported to the newspapers in Devine, Texas, and I think he said they actually ran the story or wanting to interview other landowners in the area before printing it. I spent a lot of time on this ranch as a kid and never saw anything like that. But I do recall feeling kind of uneasy towards the back of his ranch where this happened. The sky always somehow seemed darker, even on clear days when I was back there, and a lot of the mesquite trees in that area were more twisted than usual. I won't ever know what it was, though. He passed away several years ago, and the land was sold to someone that's not exactly friendly with my family. Next story. Well, this happened, and I was with my sister, and we were up a steep trail. If you went right to the top, the trail went past some beautiful trees and then ended abruptly at a very steep, almost concave. It was so steep slope that dropped into a deep ravine. Well, we stood there for a while and decided that we would make our way back down to the road by going directly down the slope, the one directly off the side of the trail, not the almost concave one, though the trees, rather than walking back to the steep rutted trail, would come up. This turned out to be a bad idea. No sooner had we gone a few feet than we discovered that there was apparently a spring right there just off the trail. The slope was full of little puddles and rivulets of clear water, clumps of grass, skinny trees, and saffron moss. Well, we debated trying to go back up and out our usual way, but it wasn't exactly that far down to the road, and it was slick and muddy and impossible to tell what was solid and what wasn't until you stepped on it. So trying to go up rather than down was harder, so we kept going down. Bad idea, again. No sooner had we gone another few feet than everything went dead. dead quiet. Not even the grasshoppers were making a sound. Along with that came the most creepy, oppressive feeling I think I've ever experienced. Both of us just shut the hell up and concentrated on hurrying along. If we had to speak, it was in a very hushed whisper. The oppressive feeling got worse and worse. Maybe I was just scaring myself, but the two words that kept popping into my head were troll, and this was pre-internet, and snake. I was so frightened at that point that I could actually feel my long hair standing straight out so much on the back of my neck that it was rubbing the collar of my t-shirt. Suddenly and without warning, we emerged onto a narrow path or deer trail. On one side of it was more of the bog, on the other was more of the almost concave steep slope and ravine. We were so relieved to get out of the water and mud that we almost wanted to giggle. That lasted right up until we saw what was right next to us in the grass. There in the grass was a mound of bones. They were all neatly stacked and interlaced. On top were two skulls of what I still believe to have been horses. Imagine if someone stacked and laced all the bones, smallest to largest, into a big oval basket, flipped it over onto the grass, and then added the skulls as a flourish. That's what it looked like. We just stood there for a moment staring at this in horror and then silently took off down the little trail as fast as we dared without breaking an ankle. The little trail soon petered out into more skinny trees, but on a gentler slope. We plunged through some small shrubs and were stunned to find ourselves on the main steep, rutted trail that led up. We had essentially made a big oval loop through the woods back to the main trail. Insanely, all the birds, tiny critters, and insects began to sing again exactly then. We were so frightened, though, that we just kept going as fast as we could safely manage. I think we both whimpered when we reached the road and my sister's old beat-up car, and we tore down the canyon, going quite a bit over the speed limit. Well, when we reached home, a good 20-minute drive, we were still damn spooked. We whispered at our story haltingly and were promptly mocked by one of our relatives who was there, an unpleasant woman of the type who thinks nothing is interesting unless it happened to her. She snickered and informed us that it was probably just the bones of a couple of elk killed by a hunter. Now, I'm usually a real zen kind of person, but I was not in the mood for it. So, I hissed at her, in your mind there's a hunter running around who goes into the mountains and shoots not one but two cow elk. Those skulls definitely never had antlers. And then instead of rolling them into a tarp one by one and sensibly hauling them down to the road, completely debones them on a narrow trail next to a bog and a steep slope. Oh, and then instead of dealing with the ton or so raw meat, he amuses himself by stacking up the bones and heads to scare passerbys. You know, I hope to God I never meet this hunter of yours. Never, ever, anywhere. She at least had the grace to look sheepish. Needless to say, my sister and I never went back up there. We both still believe the skulls were horses, too large and white in the face to have been deer for sure. Nothing more to say except it was years before I could talk about this without feeling that I was choking up with tears. And I am not much of a crier. It was just that frightening and uncanny. Next story. I've been wanting to tell this story since it happened, but after 40 years, what the heck? I was raised on a ranch on the border of Idaho and Utah. My family dates way back as cattlemen and horse breeders. We own 20,000 acres in Idaho that abut up to a spread in Utah, and then as you go east, the Utah ranch stops and heads south. We own the land next to them on the east in Utah. That's a bit larger piece at about 47,000 acres. Anyway, our horse ranch was in Idaho mostly, contained north of the border. We had a Hughes 500C helicopter, equivalent back then, and used it a lot to gather our wilds or keep track of cattle. Anyway, I was tasked to basically cover both ranches as much as possible that day. So we took off and headed north real slow, getting back in the saddle and controls, and started our sweep. Below us on the way north, we caught a group of wilds which we considered ours since they stayed on our property, but among them was a particularly marked Appaloosa pony with a design no one had ever seen. We spun down a little to do a 360 on it, and then did the rest of the sweeping of the perimeter. That horse, when we saw it, was in the southwest corner of the property. We flew north to the south and then in a zigzag. At the northeast point of land, I set it down to scope for some elk that were down in there. Elk love to mix with horses on open terrain, so you really have to look. Well, we're seeing some, but as I swept the scope further behind them, I swear to God that damn Appaloosa was grazing. I shouted to my cowhand, and he came over and I showed him, and he just whistles and says, "No way. That horse is at least miles from there and over a steep ridge." So we flew up over there and we both just stared, and as I did a high roundabout, it was the same horse, but no way. So we finished Idaho and hopped over to Utah and started doing north by south, looking over everything, and finally got into the mountains that end on our property on the final and furthest leg from the hangar on our land. And I did a low, slow pass over the rocks and boulders to see if we could catch a wolf or some coyotes. And as I banked over the ridge, I'm telling you, as you would to God, that damn horse is up in some trails on that mountain, the Appaloosa. And believe me, after that much time, you know every animal. And this one's so specifically marked. And now he's in a place he couldn't possibly be, but yet we know this is not a joke. That horse is the same one that we saw 25 miles away. Needless to say, when we got back, we buzzed the first pasture, and he was head down eating grass. I had stomach sickness come over me, and the ranch hand sitting next to me had his head down and was making the sign of the cross over and over and praying to Jesus in Spanish. Needless to say, we couldn't say anything to our bosses or my dad, or we'd be laughed off the property. Years later, I saw an article about the ranch we didn't own across the border in Utah, and the Indians named it. They called it Skinwalker Ranch, and would go there before it was owned. And I started looking into it, and it's forever burned in my mind as to whether any of the things that happened there had something to do with my horse. I really cannot allow my thoughts on this to wander. I tell myself it was our imagination. I don't know. I haven't been there for 20 years, but sometimes I feel like going to that ranch and just to see what it looks like.